Welcome to Kinship, a space where we explore dog behavior through an attachment rooted, decolonial, and deeply relational lens. I am Surabhi and I am so grateful that you are here. Today's episode is an invitation to look at the human dog relationship not just as a bond of affection or behavior, but really as a site of liberation. And I want to share that I'm coming into this episode with an incredible amount of heaviness and helplessness and powerlessness over what's happening in Gaza. The last week has been incredibly difficult, I think, as I have been engaging with images of children and adults in absolute starvation. um it's been difficult, and it's been a really rude wake up call to just how dysfunctional the world order has been, um and how and I think our role um in continuing to make space, in continuing to fight, in continuing to resist. Um, and it's brought up a lot of difficult, uncomfortable questions about what it means to be human, about how we relate to each other, how we view humanity. And I think in all of this overwhelming, almost, um, bringing really bringing like day to day life to a little bit of a standstill. I think it's just been really hard to try and find meaning and purpose and, motivation and inspiration to continue to function, quote unquote, normally. But at the same time, I think I have been really pulled and drawn closer into my own work, into my own medicine, and to really reflect on what it means to be able to resist and fight within our locus of control, within what is possible for us, so that we continue to feel the fight, um, and we continue to feel the discomfort of helplessness on the world scale, but in a way that doesn't necessarily, completely immobilize us from any sort of action. And so that's really the backdrop for this episode. And that's why it's a really loaded episode, where I'm talking about what it means to relate beyond empire, right? And how our relationships with our dogs can really become a site of liberation. And so I think the questions I want to really explore in our space today is really, what if our relationships with dogs could help us unlearn empire? What if, in our quietest moments of attunement, we are actually practicing relational repair from centuries of domination? That we're practicing ways of being that empire has tried to repeatedly erase. And so this episode isn't about dog training. None of my episodes are really about dog training, but this specific episode, I think, is so much more about what it means to experience relational freedom. It's about the kinds of love that resist control, and the interspecies kinship that reminds us that we were never meant to dominate each other. We were always meant to belong. And so I invite you to take a moment to simply settle in, feel your breath, notice your dog if they are near you, and let's begin. To understand dogs is companions in liberation, I think we first need to look at the inheritance we've been handed. Our dominant culture treats dogs as property. Legally, economically, linguistically, they are owned, they are managed, they are trained to fit into systems of convenience, of productivity, and control. This is not accidental, my friends. This is deeply rooted in the logic of colonization, which tells us that to love something is to own it. Let me say that again. Colonization tells us that to love something is to own it. That order is preferable to chaos, that any difference must be domesticated, must be tamed. And so, the same logic, by the way, applies to stealing children from indigenous communities, turning land into commodity, pathologizing emotion, punishing slowness, altering the definition of safety as obedience. The way that we've been taught to relate to dogs and, of course, to each other echoes all of this. So when we say that my dog should listen, or that I can't let them win, or that they're testing me, we are reenacting patterns of domination, most often unconsciously and without any shred of awareness, right? But it doesn't have to be this way. So, what would it really mean to practice consensual, relational, and attuned connection with a being who, quote unquote, has no legal right to consent, right? Or at least does not express consent in the way that humans really understand. And I think to me, this is one of the more, this is one of the deeper ethical questions of really sharing life with dogs, right? Because in many ways, dogs don't actually get to say no, especially in a system that doesn't recognize their sovereignty. But as humans who care, we can begin to listen for that no. We can slow down enough to hear what they need. We can become students of their subtle communication, of them turning away, of them yawning, of them lip licking, of them freezing, of them avoiding eye contact, of them growling. These are all invitations to stop, to notice, to shift, to let go of control, and to step in to connection. In this way, our relationships with dogs then become small scale, everyday sites of resistance, right? Not through protest signs and, you know, grand acts of resistance and activism, but through presence, right? Not through theory, but through practice, through just really quiet, embodied repair. This is also liberation work, because what it really is doing is it's unraveling the logics of punishment, of dominance and force that live in our bodies and behaviors that have been, internalized and deeply conditioned by us as a result of the colonialist capitalist systems that we are part of. And so when we spend time unlearning those logics, when we spend time thinking about what does it mean to be in a decolonizing relationship with relational work, we end up actually liberating ourselves from these very unconscious, unaware shackles of colonization that hold us and our relationships with our dogs, but also how care and love show up in all of our relationships. Because remember, all of us are impacted by this. And while so many of us will continue to be in denial of it and will choose to not really um, approach this with a systems lens, that denial does not make any of this invalid, or that denial does not mean that there is an absence of this effect, right? This is a very, very real impact, whether um, you want to accept it or you don't. And so I think it's, when I think about our relationship with our dogs, especially like a sites of liberation, I think it's really, it's incomplete without really talking about free living dogs. um these are dogs who essentially live outside of western domestication models, right? So these are street dogs, or streeties, as so many of us here in India fondly call them. These are village dogs, these are community dogs, right? These are dogs who don't really have a physical human home necessarily. They just exist in the larger ecosystem of a living space. And so, if I had to talk about, for example, street dogs here in India, the streets are really their homes, right? These are not stray dogs, these are not abandoned dogs, these are not wild dogs, these are not feral dogs. These are just street dogs. They were born and raised and have grown on the streets, in the streets of their homes, and their life, their way of life looks very, very different, completely different from what the life of a companion dog in a human household looks like. But even through that difference, their way of life is 100% valid, purposeful, meaningful, and important to the larger ecosystem. Just because their way of life looks different than how we raise companion dogs to be with us does not make it any less meaningful or important. And again, remember, with colonization, that difference has to be domesticated, that difference has to be tamed out. And so, so much of the work with street dogs, or so much of the narrative around street dogs, has very heavy influences of white saviorism, right? Because it's almost like we've just saved them from the streets and this really poor quality of life. But it's not. I mean, quality of life needs to be defined by so many different things. And so again, free living dogs is a whole separate conversation. And if you are really interested in that conversation, I would very highly recommend that you follow Bhak's Education. They do phenomenal work on this conversation. And so much of their ba- pretty much a big chunk of the canine education that they talk about really stems from their learning and observations and understanding of free living dogs. And so Bhak's Education is definitely going to be your place to just really view this narrative in a very, very different, non white saviorist but decolonial way. And so, coming back to free living dogs, these are dogs who don't live in crates. They don't really live in a command queue based relationship with human beings. They navigate extremely complex social systems, right? They coexist with humans, and but they're just not controlled by them. um, and so when I began my canine education with parks, I learned to study free living dogs, right? And I felt my worldview fracture and shift and transform quite obviously, because I very quickly realized, as I spent time observing them, as I opened my mind to really learning from them, that the dominant training model, this whole, alpha bullshit, isn't the only way to be with our dogs, right? A control based paradigm is not the only way to be with our dogs, right? It's not even the most natural way, by the way. Like, that's just, it's not natural. It's completely manufactured, right? It's completely manufactured to make sure that um, the power dynamic between human beings and all other species is unshifted, is unchallenged, right? It's just, I mean, this whole model where humans are superior to dogs or to any other species is one that just fits best with capitalism, with the idea of private property, with the idea of human as well as white supremacy, right? And and so free living dogs in that sense really challenge and very openly, by the way, challenged this entire model, right? And so for those of us who are able to see that, we're able to appreciate the wisdom and the guidance that comes with free living dogs. And for those of us who resisted, or who are very much still entrenched in control based paradigms and continue to value control over real connection, find their kind of living as an absolute resistance, right? To their world order, to the hierarchy that they're trying to repeatedly reinforce with these animals, and these animals don't give a flying fuck about it, which I think is also just so incredible to, I think, observe and internalize, especially if you are moving in this world, repeatedly being told to perform and work with an existing script as opposed to really lean into your own authenticity. This also sounds like a very different podcast episode, which I will definitely come back to. But I think the learning really from free living dogs is that they are so relationally fluent, right? They're not obedient. They attune to other dogs and animals in their ecosystems. They respond to human energy. They make choices. They operate with agency. They exercise autonomy. And through that exercise, even when they're exercising that autonomy and agency, they still belong to communities, and they still have access to incredible amount of care and a host of other resources because of these communities. And so I think there's something here about unpacking how we used to be with dogs versus how we have now been trained to become with dogs, right? Because again, free living dogs is obviously like one aspect of it. But even if I think back to so many indigenous and ancestral cultures, like dogs were not owned, right? They were partners, they were protectors, they were co-travelers, and even spiritual kin. Their agency was never really feared. It was respected and honored, and it was integrated into the relationships that humans had with them. And so there's such a fascinating, like, long cross cultural history of dogs as healers, for example, right? So in Babylonian cultures, dogs were really seen as the emblem of healing. And so according to some chronicles in Greek cultures, they were also seen as emissaries of God and licked people as they slept as part of healing rituals. Similar tales were found in Celtic cultures. Some stories amongst Native American tribes believe that the Great Spirit spoke to humans through animals, specifically dogs. And so all these creatures were really considered as kin. They were considered as brothers and sisters. And, we see similar stories again in Hindu mythology, right? With famous references obviously being to Yudhishthir and Lord Indra and Bhairav, with dogs really as his vahan or vehicle. And so I think and I think it's important for us to also tap into this literature, right? Because this is a really like pre-modernistic literature that exists but has also shaped so many beliefs and rites and rituals, for so many cultures and subcultures. Because again, I think what these tales and beliefs really show us is that it isn't far-fetched at all, and it isn't weird or you know too much to think of our relationship with dogs beyond these ideas of ownership, beyond these ideas of task based approaches and obedience. We are meant to have an extremely deep, like soul shifting, soul moving connection and companionship with these animals, right? Dogs have time and again demonstrated capacities for such significant and meaningful depth in their relationships with us. And this goes beyond the usual, you know marketed unwavering loyalty, and the whole, like, oh, a dog is a man's best friend kind of spiel, right? It seems like when we're actually open to it, right? Body, mind, heart, soul, that they invite us to take a transformative journey to look inwards and consequently the world around us, right? They're really asking us to step in to see how we not just relate to them, but to relate to ourselves and to relate to everyone around us. And there's this really interesting excerpt that I found in a book called Natural Histories. I think this is by somebody called Guadalupe Nettle, and she talks about how you tend to learn a lot from the animals you live with. Even fish, they are like mirrors that reflect the buried emotions and behaviors that we don't dare to see. And so when we attune to our dogs in ways that prioritize relationship over rules, we are aligning with these ancestral decolonial ways of being. We are saying, you are not here to serve me, you are here to be with me. Remember, in capitalist culture, everything, everything has to perform, even love. And so we turn dogs into emotional tools, service animals, therapy dogs, Instagram content. And while support work can be, of course, life changing and beautiful, it also risks reinforcing extractive patterns where the dog exists to help us regulate without any sort of reciprocity. And so I want to really like flip this, right? And I want to say, what if our dogs aren't here to soothe us, but what if they are here to co regulate with us? What if they're not emotional workers, but emotional kin, right? And I have seen this over and over again, not just in my own experience with my dogs, but and I've seen this with free living dogs, with streeties, with moments that the people that I work with have experienced in their relationships with their dogs. Dogs just offering quiet presence during grief, just leaning into our bodies during dysregulation, asking us to co regulate with them, mirroring our moods, not because they are trained to, but because they are with us. They are not below us or above us. They are our partners, they are companions. And this is deeply, deeply sacred. And it requires responsibility. That again, it requires responsibility, it requires accountability, and so many of us do not step up to that responsibility. So many of us do not step up to that accountability, right? Because liberation isn't about just freedom from things, it's also freedom with people and systems and practices and other species. Liberation isn't about doing whatever the fuck we want. It's about being in reciprocal relationship across differences, across species, across systems. And so what does it really look like to live this, right? To be in a relationship with your dog that is an active site of liberation, right? It's really in the daily choices. And it could be something as simple as like letting our dogs say no to touch, or say no to you know being handled a certain way. It looks like listening to them when they don't want to go to that busy park that you insist that they need to go to, right? It looks like slowing down on a walk to be able to match their pace or to let them direct where they want to go. It looks like not forcing social interaction. It looks like not training them out of behaviors that are just inconvenient to us. It looks like offering care without requiring performance in return, right? But remember, what we do in this relationship with our dogs also calls for us to do our own inner work. And I get it. I get that, inner work sounds hard and painful and scary and threatening and, very fluff. But I think at some point you've got to make a choice, right? If you want to move in this world with responsibility, with kindness, with being in right relationship with animals and humans around you, but most importantly, being in right relationship with yourself, where you are able to be an authentic, empowered individual, you cannot escape inner work. And you find the modality that works for you for that inner work, but that inner work is absolutely critical, right? And so the inner work that we need to do as we continue to sort of cultivate and foster our relationships really with our dogs as sites of liberation is also to look at healing our own need to dominate, right? It's releasing the belief that safety comes from control. It's recognizing when our dogs behaviors are actually triggering something old in us and choosing presence over punishment. This is liberation. It may not be the loud kind, but it's really the kind that begins in the nervous system. It begins in the breath. It begins in the micro choice to listen rather than just command. And so I want to ask you and invite you into a little bit of like softness. Where does control still live in your relationship with your dog? What would it feel like to release that? Maybe not all at once, but maybe gently. Where are you still seeking power over rather than power with? What if your dog is not a project or a thing to control and exercise dominance over, but a portal to another way of being, where you are relational, where you are reciprocal, where you are real, where love is not earned, where belonging is not conditional, where freedom is shared. May our relationships be places of repair. May we learn to live without owning. May we remember that liberation is not just an idea, it's a way of walking and moving together. Thank you so much for walking with me and with your dog. This is Kinship. Until next time, be soft, stay close, and walk gently.